Hey everybody, I'm Joe. We're talking about the Marvel Multiverse TTRPG today, specifically about running villains. Here we go. Villains are such a pivotal aspect of all superhero stories that we could say that it is the villain, him or herself, that defines the hero. The heroes would not need to exist in the world if it was not to oppose the machinations of the villains you create. And for those of us who are game masters, narrators in the Marvel Multiverse TTRPG, building and running villains is, or is supposed to be, one of the great joys of the game. What we want to do as narrators is build a villain and run them behind the scenes and showcase the demonstrable and negative impact they have on the world, the problems that our heroes need to solve. But eventually, all of those schemes and plans must end in a fight with our PCs going up against our villains. And if you've been playing the game at several different ranks, you've probably noticed that this is not as easy as it sounds. And immediately when that battle begins, we start running into problems as the game master who is running the villain. And these are different problems than we have if you are more experienced with other TTRPGs. Now, it is important to note that I am recording this video as of Rules Update 1.3, and that means that in a few weeks when the full game is published, there might be some alterations to what I say here that ideally would make running a villain a little bit easier. So if there are changes, I'll make sure to update my advice for running villains. But specifically, the problems that come into play when we deal with villains and running them and making those large encounters feel impactful and scary and tenuous, and making sure that there is a reasonable set of odds on the table for our heroes to win if they play well, we have some challenges to overcome. And these come about specifically because damage is calculated based on multiplication rather than addition. I'm not going to rehash it here, but I do have a whole video on how damage multiplication and damage reduction work in the game, so check that out. But when we have a villain, we start running into issues of making this villain either too easy or too hard, and getting the balance right is actually very difficult. Let's take a look at the way that we run most villains in most TTRPGs, and we're going to rely on more classic fantasy TTRPGs and the challenge rating system that exists in those. Most of our fantasy TTRPGs run a challenge rating system that runs something in the neighborhood of about CR1, or maybe a little bit below, to a CR30. And the classic advice in those scenarios is that your monsters should probably be about 4 challenge ratings higher than the level of the PCs. That's a pretty classic way to look at encounter balancing, and that also assumes that we are playing at a table with 4 PCs. Now, of course, the higher that we get in your classic fantasy TTRPGs, the less reliable this system of 4 challenge rating higher is. And some monsters, as we all know, just do not have a challenge rating that accurately reflects their difficulty. The Lich in D&D is a classic example. But generally speaking, for a player group of 4 players, we run challenge ratings of about 4 levels higher. But if we look at the math of this, assuming that the power output of monsters scales in a relatively linear fashion, and of course there is debate about that subject, we would understand that in a system that runs 1 to 30 challenge rating, making a monster 4 challenge ratings higher is an increase in power of about 13%. But this is absolutely not the case in Marvel Multiverse. In Marvel Multiverse, you only have 6 ranks. And let's get into the way that villains are actually created. The material we have in front of us right now, including the villain stat blocks that we have to reference, create villains the exact same way we create playable characters, which makes it easy to build these villains, and I appreciate that, but it also means that we are simply making another character, and that means we only have 6 ranks to go off of. 6 ranks to go off of is just not a lot, because increasing the rank of a villain by 1 is an increase in power of about 16%. And so just a 1 rank bump is already more than a 4 challenge rating bump in a more classic setting. And when we do that amount of increase, we start needing to be a little bit careful. It is easy to go too light, and it's easy to go too hard. First of all, this is an asymmetrical scaling, in my opinion. If I run a group of PCs that are at rank 2, running a rank 3 villain is still going to have at least some reasonable possibilities of doing substantive damage and being an interesting threat. And this is because at rank 2, the most amount of powers you can possibly have is 7, and that's assuming you did not go into a new power set. Having only 7 powers to choose from, it is likely that the PCs are not going to pick up any significant amount of damage reduction, and therefore a villain at a rank of 3 will be able to spike damage in an interesting way and pose an interesting threat. However, when we get to higher gameplay, we all of a sudden have players with a lot more hit points who have had a lot more opportunity to take damage reduction. And that will begin to cancel out with the damage multipliers that we give to our villains. All of a sudden, our villains are not producing a whole lot of damage at higher ranks effectively, but they're putting that up against PCs with a lot more hit points. And so we start to have some difficulties in these different ways, and it is an asymmetrical issue. I have had a villain that I have ran against 2 PCs that was made to be 1 rank higher than they were, which I felt would be a relatively appropriate challenge. This was also a villain that I gave the ability to do combat trickery and to spike damage by expending focus. In other words, I wanted a nice boss battle. However, in this particular fight, the villain rolled very low on initiative and died before being able to make a single attack. Completely unsatisfying for me and not the best experience for my players. The obvious way that we might want to solve this issue of a villain just not being able to survive a full round of combat if it goes particularly poorly on their end is to make that villain a higher rank again. Let's say now 2 ranks higher than our PCs at relatively mid or low game. But that can be a dangerous proposition, and I'll explain why. Let's say that we have a party of rank 2 heroes and they're going up against a rank 4 villain. That's just fine. This rank 4 villain is likely to have somewhere in the neighborhood of either 125 or 150 points of health, and in all likelihood around 100 points of focus, and probably some ability to ramp damage by expending focus. Don't forget, the rule for expending focus is you can expend on an individual power an amount of focus that is equal to 5 times your rank. Villains have the same rank categorization as our heroes, and therefore would be able to expend 20 points of focus. Rank 2 heroes are likely to have around 75 points of health. And let us say that our villain expends focus in a maximum amount for every hit that he or she gets. A rank 4 villain is likely to have at least 1 level of damage multiplication more than our heroes have of damage reduction. I would argue it's probably likely that they have 2 or 3 levels more, but let's go ahead and be conservative on this point. In this instance, our villain is likely to do, rounded down, about 17 points of damage before adding any damage from expending focus. If they expend focus, that is at least 20 points that they are able to get, and that's not assuming a fantastic success. Therefore, that villain is able to pump out 37 points of damage. That is 2 shots to be able to take out a full PC. But it will probably be worse than that, because by 4 levels of our villain's career, they're likely to have combat trickery. I want to give this to my villains to pose an interesting threat, but now I'm in a position where if the villain does what the villain would do, I can one-shot a player. And so I'm in an interesting quandary. I want to make my villains very dangerous, but if I give them the ability to simply one-shot a player, that's not as much fun. And so what am I really to do in this case? Am I to take away some of the abilities my villain would have and therefore not run something that is as tough? Or am I supposed to simply one-shot a player? And that's not as interesting either. I want it to be a dangerous situation where they feel the threat growing. And by the way, all of this assumes that I only have 1 level of damage multiplication over their level of damage reduction. It can get a lot worse than that. I think that it would be worse than that, because if I'm looking at rank 2 heroes, they've only got the ability to have either 6 or 7 powers tops. And with only 7 powers, you really are likely to have minimized your damage reduction. You're probably delaying that in some way so that you can create the core of your build, something I've talked about in character building before. And as a result, my villain with 4 ranks is very likely to have had the opportunity to take more levels of damage multiplication. And so perhaps the answer at this point is to simply tailor the amount of damage multiplying that my villains get to the amount of damage reduction that my heroes actually have, and tailor them as such. And that would work, but it's not an easy way of making a generic stat block, is it? The solution is not necessarily to lower the rank of the villain either, because if I lower it too much, they're just not going to have the hit points to survive. In other words, your hit points do not scale at the same rate as damage multiplication does necessarily, so we have to be careful about that. What's really important to note is that if you were to take a villain and simply lower the rank in order to lower the hit points, you might be in a situation where now they are underpowered. And of course, this is a balancing act for all TTRPGs, but the reality of Marvel Multiverse is that your hit points do not scale in the same way as your damage multiplication or damage reduction do. And that makes it tricky to get the balance correct. So what do we really need? We need our villains to have stat blocks that are actually different than our heroes. It's a nice idea to build them the same way as our heroes, but in the end, that is going to make a villain that is either way too weak, or when we make them an interesting threat, potentially too powerful, or have so much damage reduction that the battle goes on for too long. Instead, the middle ground is to take this game's villains and to actually give them stat blocks more reminiscent of other TTRPGs. So let's take a look at some mechanics from other TTRPGs that are interesting and I think appropriate to give to our big villains in Marvel Multiverse. The first thing is different mobility. There are strict rules for PCs on the mobility that they have. They have a certain amount of speed, which is related to their size and their agility score. And of course, different types of mobility are assumed to either be half speed or you have to take a power to get them, such as flight. Our villains should be different. We need to find ways to give our villains different types of mobility. Now, this might just be giving a villain the ability to fly, which of course is an interesting mechanic, but perhaps teleportation or perhaps just additional speed in some way. We want to make sure our villains are mobile on the battlefield. The next thing is we need to give our big villains legendary actions. For them to have only one action in a full round of combat, plus whatever their reaction is probably not going to make them as interesting of a villain. Legendary actions should include, but are not limited to, being able to move half their speed, being able to do some kind of an effect that is not damage dealing, but it changes the battlefield or improves their situation in some way, or perhaps being able to do an attack that is a lower damage amount attack. All of these things feel appropriate for villains, and I think it would immediately make them scarier. Next is some kind of a layer action. I have always been an advocate of making villains and placing the actual combat in a space that is changing. Here's the best advice I can give on this point. Simply create, for every single encounter that you ever do, a layer action or an environment action at the initiative count 20. Initiative count 20, you just put it as environment, and something changes every single round. This is something that could be simply shifting the ground underneath, or it could be responsive to the villain in some way, but change the environment. And it's probably going to be in a way that is disadvantageous to the goal that our heroes have. Speaking of the goal that our heroes have, placing our encounters in a space where the villain is actively trying to do something, think of the end of just about any superhero movie you've ever seen, is going to make that encounter more interesting. Now, people have talked about this as an idea in encounter building for a very long time, having something that is happening in the space, right? But with villains, you have such an amazing array of things to choose from. Your villain has some sort of evil plot. Maybe this is a death ray, maybe it's a bomb that's going to go off. They're going to have something that is ticking, and that is going to give you a more interesting environment. And perhaps they're not the only ones doing it. Perhaps their minions are helping. The minion rule from 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons is one of the most beneficial ways of improving your boss fights, and let's explore it if you haven't looked at it. The way that minions were created in 4th edition D&D is that they were bad guys with 1 hit point. That's it, they had 1 hit point. They were there simply to be cannon fodder, but they allowed our villains to be able to push their plan forward, perhaps by trying to deliver that death ray or aim it or utilize it in some way, thus creating an important situation. They also allowed the minions to throw themselves in front of an attack so that they absorbed it and the villain did not. In a story about superheroes, we have every reason to believe that most of our villains would have minions. It's a common thing in most superhero stories. Give them minions, give them 1 hit point, and also assume that they do not have a damage multiplier that would be over and above the damage reduction of your heroes. In other words, the damage they do is a flat number that's equal to their ability modifier. Now, you don't even need to worry about calculating damage if they attack. You simply roll to attack and apply the amount of damage. This is going to make it easy to run them. You also never need to think about hit points because 1 hit and they go down. One last thing I think that we can do for villains to make them more interesting at high ranks is villains need to have ranks they can achieve that our heroes simply cannot. We need to have a rank 7 or maybe even a rank 8 for the game. And I would put very specific rules in place that for rank 7 and 8 villains cannot go into new power sets, but they can do another ability score point buy, and they can gain an additional 3 powers per rank, maybe not 4. I'll have to do some experimenting, or maybe you'll have to do some experimenting to see how that fits in high rank gameplay. But if I have rank 6 heroes, simply throwing a rank 6 villain at them is just not going to be good enough. I need them to really have a power spike and have that really large presence on the battlefield and in the game. And I think having ranks obtainable by villains that are not obtainable by heroes is the way to do it. And the last piece of advice is actually about the scenario that we run our villains in. Villains want to do terrible, awful things, and it's usually not their goal to kill the hero. It's usually their goal to do something else. And as a result, I think it totally appropriate that a villain would either be trying to finish a diabolical plan or simply fight for a little bit and run away, and have your villains have some kind of mechanism that allows them to attempt an escape. This will allow them to escape and fight another day, or perhaps lead to a chase sequence or something along those lines. It's always an interesting point. I've been thinking about running villains and the difficulties thereof for a while because my game of Marvel Multiverse, my PCs have hit rank 4, and I'm running into situations where I need to have a villain and I need to have 6 or 7 minions. And as a result, my combats are getting a little bit more convoluted because I need to create an appropriate challenge. I had to run a situation where I had one villain with minions and then another villain afterwards, simply to pose an interesting threat. But those are the kinds of solutions we need to think about. And as a result, something I'm going to start doing on this channel is analyzing the villain stat blocks that we are given by Marvel, and take a look at if they're appropriate, how I would run that villain, and what level the PCs should be at in order to encounter them. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for joining me. YouTube is literally made out of buttons. I hope you press some of them, and I'll see you next time. All right, peace.